Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Terry Clark. I'm the Arizona Literacy Director, and on behalf of Read On Arizona and Read On Phoenix, I'd like to welcome all of you to our first ever Early Literacy Summit. We're so fortunate to have our next speaker here with us today. Nonie leads a research program at Harvard University that's focused on increasing learning opportunities for students from diverse linguistic, cultural, and economic backgrounds in today's classrooms. Her research on vocabulary development and instructional strategies to prevent reading difficulties has implications for practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. And in fact, the Lead for Literacy memo series that her group put out is actually included in your folder today because it's such an excellent summary of what a comprehensive approach to strengthening literacy skills looks like for young children. She's the author of Making Assessment Matter, Using Test Results to Differentiate Reading Instruction, written for instructional leaders and teachers. And she was also the lead author on Turning the Page, Refocusing Massachusetts for Reading Success, which forms the basis of their third grade reading proficiency bill that was passed not too long ago. In 2009, she was the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Awards for Scientists and Engineers. It's the highest honor given by the United States government to young professionals beginning their independent research careers. And she has just taken that and run with it. And we're just so pleased to have you. I've described it as I've been walking on air since about July when she committed to coming and speaking at this summit. So we're thrilled to have you. And now please help me welcome Nonie Lesaux.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation. I can say that I'm just amazed by what has gone on in Arizona in a brief year. So certainly it's not even in the very early stages of a campaign, presumably thanks to Terry and all of the folks that she seems to be able to gather and corral and get around this issue. It feels to me like a much more developed campaign with some ways to go, but with the absolute foundation and political will and excitement that it's going to take to get to where you all want to get to. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for the invitation, thank Terry especially. Like she said, I've been sort of at this work in different ways. My roots are really as a special educator and school psychologist in Vancouver, British Columbia. And in the mid to late 90s, Vancouver as a city had been absolutely transformed demographically, and yet, in fact, my own training at the time really hadn't felt like it mapped on well to our school-age population. We had a lot of questions about how we might actually, in fact, promote reading development and language development for all students, all children in our communities and in our schools. And some of you may know that Vancouver, as a city, actually hosts both the poorest neighborhood in Canada and the wealthiest neighborhood in Canada, not far from each other. And so for the school district, it was the same kinds of challenges that we all think about. How is it that we increase opportunities to learn for everyone? So when you focus a lot on the individual at-risk reader, you very quickly come to the idea of how is it that we're going to better design the system, not serve individual students necessarily, but as an educational community, as a city, as a state, how can we better design and deliver supports for all students and respond to the needs, today's societal needs in terms of literacy skills. So what I've put together for today is really what I thought might be a helpful way to think about your own work and your own initiatives going forward, what we're learning both in Massachusetts and across the country around these issues. Certainly in some ways, third grade reading has had a resurgence. There was a time when probably about 15 to 20 years ago when there was a lot of buzz around early reading. Now we're sort of back to third grade, but with the idea that we're really not just talking about third grade, we're talking about what it takes to get to third grade. So let me just start this up. So what I wanted to do was really just spend some time on these questions, but before we do that, I wanted to really anchor this work, especially for those of you who are not here in this room. It's nice to get right to children sometimes when we do this work. So what I wanted to do was introduce you to Nathan and Shelby and their kindergarten classroom on a given morning. Miss Frommer sits on a bright red cushioned chair with a book on her lap and a large and colorful calendar behind her. With her class of kindergartners beginning to gather on the carpet in front of her chair, she waits patiently and smiles. So we've all been there. Meanwhile, Nathan finds an open spot up close to the teacher and sits cross-legged on the rug. His heart is racing, but only with excitement. He didn't even feel nervous as he kissed his mother goodbye and entered the classroom all by himself that morning. They had talked about getting ready for kindergarten ever since he was a 3-year-old, and he met then weekly with Rebecca, an early intervention specialist who came to their house. In fact, then they would sit on the floor just like Nathan's class is about to do and talk about books of all kinds. He enjoyed it so much that he and his mother started going to the public library regularly. And this past summer, he went to story time whenever his mom could bring him. He loves getting books from the library, puts them on the shelf right at home next to his own special books a neighbor gives him every now and again. Nathan's mom reads those books over and over again, and he just loves to look at the pictures and pretend to read the books to himself too. Nathan couldn't wait for Miss Frommer to begin to read. He is feeling very ready for kindergarten. Shelby, in the meantime, sits down on a far corner of the rug. Her heart is racing too. She is so nervous. She had been happy enough playing in the dress-up area while she was trying on the fire hat and red boots, but she had never sat quietly like this with so many children she doesn't know and a teacher up front. She tries to listen to what Miss Frommer is saying. She hears her explaining about the book they are going to read together about September and autumn and something about this season when the temperature gets cooler. What is she talking about? Is she going to tell them what this means? After a while, she looks around the room, and instead of listening to whatever Miss Frommer is saying, she's interested in anything but. At this point, Miss Frommer reaches for a book, holds it up in her right hand, and asks the class what they think the book is going to be about. Nathan hasn't read the book before, but he sees a picture of a school bus with kids his age on the cover, and his hand shoots up in the air. Shelby thinks he must have read that book at home, and now he must know the answer. When he's called on, he says he'd never heard the story before, but he thinks it's probably about going to school because he knows that the picture on the cover always gives clues about what books are about. And then Miss Frommer asks about the letters that the words on one page start with and how they sound. She talks with another child about how the words mean something about the seasons. Shelby's mind is spinning. She's really feeling left out, and she has lost track of the story. She really wants morning meeting to end. So we anchor our work often in the children themselves. We imagine that morning, imagine that we want a system that serves both Nathan and Shelby doesn't necessarily start, quote unquote, behind the game. We think about the way in which going forward, Nathan may well get more out of the learning opportunities and more out of that instruction than Shelby, although they will both probably get something. So for today, I really want to talk about and address 3 guiding questions. The first being, how is it that we might come to a comprehensive plan for improving children's learning outcomes? What's behind the plan that Terry talked about that we developed in Massachusetts that's reflected in the literacy memos in your packet? The second is what it is that we're learning about the language and literacy development of children from diverse backgrounds and how we think about that literacy profile. And finally, we think a lot about the key strategies and levers for increasing really the quality of children's language and reading environments, which of course we're all here today to come together on and focus on. So the Arizona landscape, before we start, I'll just sort of suggest that the data in Arizona look very similar to the data across many states, which is that we have demographics of reading and reading difficulties, certainly. We've got a large population of children, 0 to 5 in the state. We've got about 1 in 3 growing up in poverty, so we remind ourselves of that relationship there. We have about 1 in 4 enrolled in preschool, and if we think about targets, we're probably going to want to increase that number over time, especially with 3rd grade reading in mind. In our K-12 population across the state, we're nearing 2,000 schools. We've got about 60% of students, sort of that 1 in 3, kind of 2/3 number, eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And we've got at least 30% of students from immigrant backgrounds, which of course matters for linguistic diversity. We also, not surprisingly, have the same kinds of relationships that we see across the country, and for those of you who had a good look at the NAEP scores yesterday, it's really no different. We know, unfortunately, that those students, in general, were batting about 500 for students being proficient in reading by 3rd grade or 4th grade, as the case may be for the national kids count data. So we're looking at about 1 in every 2 students overall. We know that when we move then to certain demographic groups, for example, those students who qualify for free or reduced price lunch, about 2/3 plus, and here in Arizona it's probably closer, looks like it's closer to 85% perform at a below basic or below proficient reading level. At the English language learner rate, we're looking there at most English language learners qualifying or performing below proficient on measures of reading achievement. We think a lot, obviously, in this room, we ought to think a lot about the relationship between the linguistic diversity and the growing up in poverty and what that means for how we mount a successful 3rd grade reading campaign. We want to think about the fact that in and of itself, linguistic diversity is an asset. It's a societal asset. We also know that at the level of the individual, it holds cognitive advantages. Overall, if we are able to disentangle the poverty from the linguistic diversity, we know that overall bilingualism is an asset, and we see actually heightened academic achievement among students who successfully develop 2 languages. The issue that we're up against here and across the country to think through is how it is we make those learning environments even richer so that we really do provide all students with the opportunity to develop advanced literacy skills, so that we don't see the high rates of special education placement that we tend to see clustered among students from low-income households and/or households where English is not the language spoken. And I should say very clearly that special education was not designed for any one demographic population. And yet when we look at school-level data across states in urban settings, we find that there's a 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 ratio of students from minority backgrounds identified for special education placement as compared to their majority culture peers. And that certainly is just a manifestation of not quite getting enough right early on for these students overall. And so not surprisingly, we see very high dropout rates among certain populations over others. So we think a lot about the demographics of reading difficulties. At the same time, and certainly from a lot of the state and national level work I've been doing, we also have this nagging and very serious reminder that as a nation, we are not keeping pace with the changing literacy demands of the society and the knowledge-based economy. We are not developing all of our students at sufficient rates to really have the 21st century literacy skills that they need to participate fully in this society. So we think about pulling many students along, and we think about pushing many and all students forward, which is to say that our business community, for example, nationally is spending about $3 billion a year on remediating technical writing skills as an example of the kinds of 21st century skills that we aren't sufficiently developing among our populations. Our remediation rates at 4-year colleges during the freshman year have never been higher than they are now, and any student who is engaged in freshman remediation classes is much less likely to graduate from college in a timely manner. So we think about capitalizing on attributes and resources. We think about elevating the bar at every reading level, and we think, therefore, then, as we heard this morning about a minute ago, excuse me, with the time change, I'm not sure what time it is. We think about just increasing individual and societal prosperity at the same time. Let's not talk about whether it's economics or individuals. Let's talk about a generally healthy population that then holds up a fabulous society and economy. So where is it that we go from here? Well, what I want to do today is just make a few points, and in order to do that, I want to define reading in the way that I define it and we define it in our work collectively so that we can really be more specific and more precise as we move forward in this work. So if we take this fifth grade passage about high-speed trains, there are all kinds of skills that you and I engage in. We tap our own skills and competencies to get through this. And what I want to point out is we think about those skills really in two domains, and that helps to guide our work 0 to 8 to develop strong and healthy individuals. So if we take this passage, very briefly, there are word level skills that we need, right? We know the word pattern that goes with the word high is part of a family, right? The words sigh and thigh, and we understand that pattern, and we pronounce it in a way that is different from how it might look if we took it at face value. We know that to get through the word speed, what we actually do, if that word were unfamiliar to us as readers, is we would break it apart into 4 different sounds and then put it back together again and quote-unquote read it as speed. We know that the 5th grader needs to get through this passage reading at about 115 words correct per minute in order to have the space or the room left over to make meaning of it, which is to say, we have to get through it quickly enough in order to be able to actually think about what we're reading. So if you imagine yourself, you sit down with the newspaper, your mind wanders, and you say to yourself, I've got to go back to the beginning to really make sense of this again. I didn't get through it quickly enough to be processing it at the same time. And once you do that, when you're doing that kind of processing, there are all kinds of other skills and competencies that you're bringing into this. You know the way in which service is used, in this case, a passenger service on a train, as different from service at the restaurant, right? There are 14, in fact, different entries for the word service. So we know that in text, a lot of words are used with slightly different meanings than we tend to use day to day in conversation. You have to bring enough information and knowledge about trains to even get something from this passage. You wouldn't learn about trains just by reading this. You'd have to be interested and motivated to get through it. You've got to be at some level engaged in this, and we've all certainly today even come across pieces of information and text that we're more interested in than others, and some of that has to do with how much we know about the topic. And you'd have to have lots of different strategies to better understand it if, in fact, you didn't really understand it at the first pass. So when you do that, what I want to push on is that you are engaging two different sets of skills. On the mechanics side, we call them skills-based competencies, which is to say, having that word family and having the ability to break out that word speed into its different sounds and having the skills to read it at 115 words per minute, we think of as really the mechanics of reading. There are 26 letters and 44 sounds, and they're mastery-oriented. Usually about by the end of 2nd grade, students have these skills down pat. The great majority of students develop their word-level reading skills, the ability to read print on the page, usually by the end of 2nd grade or so. On the other side, the knowledge-based competencies are the competencies that we start developing at birth, in fact, because, of course, our language and our vocabulary and our knowledge about the world starts building up really from infancy. And they have to develop all the way up through adolescence if we're going to keep pace with the way in which language and reading becomes more complex over time. And what I really want to push on as Terry and her team at Read On Arizona continue to do their work is that we want to be very clear that today, when we look at the populations that we are most concerned about, we are doing a good job developing their skills-based competencies. They are mastering, in many cases, the mechanics of reading, the how to read the words on the page. But if you look at these data here, following a national study that we conducted for 10 years, following a sample of about 300 families, we recruited them from Head Start preschools. We looked at their literacy development from age 4 to age 14. We collectively, the system, and we can, I'm willing to say we because we're all a part of this, but this is a group of 300 students who went off into high school, 9th grade, with vocabulary and reading comprehension levels at the 20th percentile. Up through the system, right? Enrolled in preschools, attendance looks good. They got there, they were there. Parents imagined that things were going very well because they hadn't necessarily heard about bad performance. They didn't really have great information about their academic achievement. But what we're getting is this huge gap between their ability to read the words on the page and really make meaning from text, and therefore engage in good reading and writing and listening and speaking. That's really knowledge-based. That's about how they come to build up enough knowledge about the world to make sense of print. So when I teach this finding with our group of reading specialists every year in our master's program, what I say is it's actually not unlike if one of us were to enroll in a graduate level seminar in a field of study that we'd never been exposed to before. So I could go over to the biochemistry department and I could read the words on the page. I have the mechanical skills, but I don't bring enough knowledge to the page in order to be at grade level. I'm going to get something out of that text because I'm there, I've been there, and these students have been there in schools, in their classrooms, all the way up through the system. But they haven't accumulated enough knowledge, and in this case, academic vocabulary, to really make sense of what they're reading. And when we think about the way in which we deliver the curriculum in high school, statistically, the odds are against most of these students when we think about high school graduation. They are very unlikely to independently handle the text demands of high school, despite being up through the system. When we replicate this study on the West Coast in the San Diego Unified District, we get exactly the same finding. When we look at national data, we get exactly the same finding. What I want to be clear about very briefly is if you look at the numbers that compare their rates of growth to the rates of growth that were expected for them based on the national test, you actually see, what do you see? Higher rates of growth for the sample we studied than for the national average. Higher rates of growth. So what this highlights is the difference between growth and performance. These children were actually learning at higher rates than what we would have expected from them along the way. The problem is it wasn't high enough to catch up and make up the gains, right? So I think about my own to-do list. I feel like I get a lot done every day and every week, but it's never quite enough to catch up and get ahead, right? It's the same idea. These are students who are learning 2 words for every 1 word their native English-speaking peer is learning. The problem is it wasn't enough to get them where they needed to go. I should say their native English-speaking peer probably from a nationally representative sample would put them in the middle class bucket. And when we do this comparison and take these data and replicate them on the West Coast and make a comparison between our language minority learners, our English language learners, and their native English-speaking peers, you will see that in fact the difference by the time we're into middle school, these are 6th grade data, the difference is really not a meaningful difference, which is to say what we're really talking about is building up the knowledge-based competencies in our at-risk populations in ways that's really going to meaningfully get them to where they need to go. So we see that same gap between the 2 groups, between their mechanical skills or their skills-based competencies and their knowledge-based competencies over time. And these are, again, a sample educated up through the system of native English speakers. But once we're into urban districts, we may not need to make quite the distinctions that we're making, and we may be thinking more about knowledge-based skills and competencies in the overall population. So just want to push on those 2 problem spaces as we move into a discussion about a comprehensive plan, that there's the skills-based competencies and there's knowledge-based competencies. And the knowledge-based competencies is really the next stage of a lot of work for a lot of campaigns across the country. It's a much harder problem space. It's a much deeper problem, right? We need to build up, it has to accumulate over time one's concepts and knowledge about the world, their ability to understand and express their ideas. To have those oral and written language skills, it's going to take a different kind of effort. So what does this mean for our learners if we go back to Nathan and Isabella and all of those children that you see regularly? We're talking about that birth to 8 continuum. We're talking about thinking about third grade reading as merely the outcome and a proxy for what happened from the time that child entered our community as an infant. And when we do that kind of work, we pay a lot of attention to how much language they ought to be building up over the years in order to get to those 50,000, really what are words, but concepts and ideas about the world that they need by the time they leave high school. And it means that for many of our good readers, they're accumulating between 2,000 and 3,000 words a year just by virtue of being exposed to a lot of different and big ideas. So our first lesson is really thinking about the role of language in reading, that if we think about reading as strictly the words on the page and the print, we're not going to get there. And in fact, some of our strongest and most effective initiatives don't actually involve print until kids are much older, right? So when we think about working with families and in early education and care settings, we think a lot about the language-based activities, the storytelling, the songs, the rhyming, and all of the kind of language-based work that can go on, the providing a narrative and an account of what is happening day to day, right, with our toddlers. It's that kind of thing that we think about long before we're pushing strictly the reading the words on the page. The second is we're going to move past thinking around proficiency and get into this idea that if we're going to pull our readers along and push everyone forward, we're going to be talking about an even more complex sort of knowledge-based curriculum than one we often have today. And our third lesson is really that it's about different contexts. And certainly, as we've heard a couple of times today, this isn't going to be the job of any one institution or sector or agency in the community, that we're really talking about homes and families and early education and care settings in our communities. And we think a lot about the kinds of places and interactions that children have every day over time. When we do this work, and when we did this work and designed it in Massachusetts, we came up with a 5-pronged plan, or a plan that would be a real comprehensive effort. And I'll tell you a little bit about those 5 approaches. One is we focus a lot on program design and implementation for impact. And that is that there are a lot of cases where we might get this campaign off the ground and have a lot of excellent initiatives going on. And at the same time, some of them are going to need to be more intensive and last longer and result in more interactions and treatment for many students than we currently might be experiencing. So we think a lot about the sufficient intensity, duration, and scope to really move from the raising awareness about the issue to the changing behaviors that we want to see in our adults and our children. And so we ask about the key ingredients. What is it that's working? Is it that we're doing enough to actually change the behaviors? Are we preventing the difficulties in raising rates? And are we delivering the program or support as designed? And sometimes what we find in that bucket is that often over time, programs and initiatives lose their core and central components as we get farther and farther away from their early implementation. And we want to keep that in mind as you move forward. The second is, of course, you won't be surprised that we've been pushing for earlier screening and assessment, both of children, but also of the quality and settings and of quality of the settings and services that they're receiving. So we think a lot about, for example, in Massachusetts and not unlike many other states, third grade is the first time we take a good hard look at the reading skills right across the state population. Third grade is just much too late to flag students who are having difficulties. Imagine if every day you went off to school thinking, I don't do this reading thing well, I don't really do this school thing very well, and now it's third grade or the spring of third grade, which really puts you to the fall of fourth grade before we've decided there's a problem and we're going to provide intervention and services. So been looking at 3- and 4-year-old screening. Wouldn't necessarily be obviously in school settings, but there are many touch points that we can think about to implement such a state-level initiative in order to both increase the quality of the settings that children are in, but also to flag those who are at risk. We've been pushing on the ways in which some of this is going to be about workforce development and different models of professional training and support that are more intense and more sustained for educators and caregivers who are part of children's lives every day. That we've often, we have often had the habit of imagining that one workshop or a one-day training is going to be enough to change behavior, and that's a mindset and a practice that we want to collectively address as one that is not going to get us to where we need to go. We see it in the home visiting world, we see it in the world of pre-K to 12 education with teachers and lots of places in between. We have talked and pushed a lot on the role of curriculum in all of this, that in our early education and care settings and in our pre-K to 12 classrooms, teachers cannot design and deliver curricula in real time, that we need to arm them with the kind of long-term plans that will build up Nathan and Shelby's knowledge about the world, that will help address some of those gaps. They're going to have to be language-rich, rigorous, and engaging, and it's not in fact sustainable nor feasible to ask teachers to deliver, to both design and deliver such long-term plans day after day, year after year. We think about those curricula having rich text at their core. We think about the way in which they are providing both opportunities to learn that are direct, the result of direct and explicit instruction. We also think about the way in which some of this is going to be child-directed, inquiry-based kinds of experiences. We've been working also on family partnerships, on taking the word partnership very seriously, partnering with families around their child's development, linking family engagement activities and initiatives to children's learning and outcomes. Some of the largest effects in the field are from initiatives that actually really focus right in on children's progress. And we've been working, not surprisingly, we've heard a lot about this today, on strengthening the family literacy community library connection. In some respects, that can be very concrete in nature. So in Massachusetts, we've been working hard on just the hours of opening as a start for imagining the kinds of places that we want families to be. And as your mayor mentioned, we've been tapping community leaders and thinking about all of the different players who have a role in this work. I want to finish out right now, before I take some questions, and just push a little more on the architecture of the system with respect to program design and implementation for impact. And as you move forward in this work, and you're certainly more than well poised to do so, I want to draw out this idea of the difference between awareness raising and behavior changing, and the idea that we have initiatives that we want to be able to map onto such a continuum, and some in their own right are exactly meant to raise awareness, and others are going to have to change behaviors if we are going to get to where we need to go. And some of those are going to take more time and money and human capital in order to get there. But so what I want to push on is for you to perhaps think about 3 types of initiatives as you move forward with this work. The first being an awareness-raising initiative, excellent and good in its own right. Certainly the beginning of a strong campaign is about awareness raising. The second type of initiative would be one that imposes a structural change on the system, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And the third would be a capacity building initiative. And eventually, we're going to need a lot of capacity building initiatives to get to where we want to go. So let me walk you through some examples. If we were to take the awareness raising, we'd put, for example, a book drive. That's a very good awareness raising mechanism. It speaks to the importance of books and literacy. Its short-term impacts would be there are warm feelings about literacy, there are more books in the home, There are no evidence of its effects on its own, on children's outcomes, and that's fine because it wasn't meant to be a direct service. It was meant to raise awareness in the population. A structural change that I think is very salient to your work now and work across the states in the U.S. is structural change might be a grade retention policy or a class size policy around class size. The short-term impact of those structural changes tends to be a bump in achievement. We often do see a bump when we impose a structural kind of change, like class size reduction or grade retention. The long-term impact of those tends to fade out. We don't tend to get really long-term effects, so we're looking at sort of a short-run game. So in the research on retention very clearly suggests a fade out, and in fact, in many cases, there are other consequences that come with the fact that this is a student who still struggles, right? So we get social problems, we often get dropout and that kind of thing, because the student is still struggling. The capacity building kinds of initiatives are those that have a much longer run end game in mind, right? They're ones that we imagine taking more time, that require more of an investment, but that have both short-term and long-term impacts. And so here I might give high-quality preschool as an example. I might also provide an example of an initiative that targets the quality of early reading instruction, right? That we get the short-term bump, but we also get a much nicer view and a much healthier population overall in the long run. So as you move forward with this work, you may want to think about that third bucket and really push on these initiatives that would be considered capacity building. So if we take the difference between a structural and a capacity building lever and just imagine that there's a child experiencing difficulties, behavioral or academic, if the school's response is strictly grade retention, then we get a likely outcome that has limited effects and some long-term costs. If the school's response, which is more intensive and more expensive and costly, both in human resources and financial, we get targeted, timely intervention, we're likely to get stronger outcomes. But again, it's a longer run game and it takes a different kind of mindset and a different kind of structure architecturally. So I'm going to sum up there. I'm going to certainly mention that there are lots of individuals who are behind this work. I've been collaborating now at Harvard for about 10 years with different folks and been very graciously supported by a lot of funders. So why don't I stop there? I'd be happy to take a few questions. If you have a question, Terry is going to give you the microphone. Silence. Put this plan back up, actually.
Jeff, I can count on you.
Hi, Jeff Smith, Baltimore School District. You just mentioned something about language and it may not map easily to school.
Right.
Can you expand on that a little bit? We have a lot of Spanish-speaking students in Arizona and other countries.
Right. I think you probably read that on that slide with the Venn diagram, that there are certain risk factors associated with children who grow up in poverty and children who may come from households where English is not the language of instruction and who enter school and English is the language of instruction. The home language, whether it's English or in this case Spanish, doesn't always lend itself easily to the language that the sixth grader is up against in text. So that is to say that we don't speak necessarily the way the textbook authors and other authors are writing these days. And the gap between our daily language, even among those of us who are educated, and the language of print is on the rise. It's increasing year to year. And I just saw recently some really nice data that suggests we just continue to write and to demand an academic register of language that is very distant in many cases from the language that our children are using day to day. And so in that sense, it puts onto the system the need to really teach and unpack the language that is being used in print that is giving kids a really hard time. If we go back to those data in all of the studies that we're doing, I should be very clear that our students have very well-developed day-to-day conversational English, both our native English speakers and our students who might be considered English language learners or former English language learners. Their difficulties are when they are reading independently and having to learn from text in order to do their work independently, that they just don't have enough to bring to that printed page. Does that make sense? So we are getting this gap that's, even you and the article that I was reading suggested the newspaper still, even though everyone's complaining about newspapers and the language today and the rags that they are, they're using about 70 academic words per 100, and we are using about 17 per 100 when we speak to one another, right? We're speaking less, our sentences are shorter, our communication is just not as academic, and it used to be that it was much more closely mapping on to print than it is today. And some of the college and career ready standards are pushing on that idea, that we need just more complex language in our classrooms and outside of our classrooms. Yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth Hyde, Arizona State University. You kind of alluded to this, but I'm wondering, in your research or in your travels, have you found any insights about what the content areas, social studies, science, and even the arts play in early literacy development?
If we could bring much more content-rich material into our preschools, we would be better off. So some of the best findings right now, some of the latest, probably the strongest study of preschool effects has recently just come out of the Boston Public Schools, suggesting just gains that hold over time that give kids a true edge, not just a short-term bump. That curriculum that they use in their high-quality 4-year-old pre-K classrooms is entirely science-based. So their literacy curriculum itself is science-based. Why? Because you can set up the classroom beautifully. You can have all kinds of hands-on learning that is not about reading words on the page, right, and pushing just on print, but you can study some abstract concepts and start to see them come to life. So we can be outside studying, we can have one unit that spans all of the learning centers in our classroom, but we also end up using the language that goes with science, right? That's not conversational day-to-day language. So while we have tended with young children towards our community and our neighborhood and some very friendly conversational language, and we label the classroom, the table, and the chair, what we really ought to be doing is just more in still very developmentally appropriate, friendly ways, bringing much more content to bear. Some of our work in dramatic arts has real potential at the early childhood level. Yeah. Thank you.